Do you have a Ruby on Rails application using Rubocop? If so, you know how beneficial using static code analysis tools can be in keeping your codebase clean and organized. However, one issue I often notice is that developers on these projects don't fully take advantage of Rubocop during the development process. They don't run the static code analysis frequently, so they're not making the most out of having this very powerful tool helping them. In this video, I'll show you a couple ways to run Rubocop early and often, so you and your team can ensure you're avoiding inconsistencies and bugs while maintaining your code for the long haul. In a previous video on this channel, I went through the initial process of setting up Rubocop on a long-running Ruby on Rails project I built called Airport Gap. In that video, I showed how to begin chipping away at all those issues that show up when you install Rubocop for the first time on a legacy project, tackling a few offenses along the way. After that video, I set up the static code analysis rules I wanted for this project, and went through the remainder of the offenses that Rubocop found and fixed them all. Now my codebase for this project is well organized and consistent without any to-do configuration files, and I want to keep it that way. I can now run the Rubocop command anytime I make changes to the codebase to ensure that it's still compliant with the project's rules, but I know that I'll eventually forget something that will slip through the cracks. I want to automate this process as much as I can so I can address any offenses throughout the development workflow and prevent myself and other developers working on this project from committing inconsistent code. Here are a couple ways that I address this in the Rails projects that I work on. The first tip is to set up your code editor to highlight any Rubocop offenses as you're working on the project. This can be done through plugins or extensions. My preferred code editor is VS Code, and one of the best extensions I found not only for checking Rubocop offenses but for working with Ruby projects is the Ruby LSP extension by Shopify. This extension contains a ton of functionality to help you develop Ruby projects, including built-in support for highlighting any Rubocop offenses in your project. Let's install it in this code editor to see it in action. To install an extension on VS Code, let's go to the activity bar on the right, then click on the extensions icon, which is this one with the blocks. Here, let's search the extensions marketplace for Ruby LSP. A few results will show up, but the one we want is the extension created by Shopify, which is the first result here. Now, I already have this extension installed, but if you don't have it installed, just click the install button that shows up on this page. Once the extension is installed, it'll automatically pick up our Rubocop configuration and detect any offenses right in the editor. Let's see how this works. I'm going to open a file as an example. So open this API controller file. Let's say that I want to add a new key to this not found error response. Like example, let's say a new code key. I do want to give it a value of not found. So one of the rules that I have for my Rubocop setup is to enforce the use of single quotes for strings if there's no interpolation. So let's say I add this string and I add it as double quotes. So as you can see, the Ruby LSP extension noticed that this code isn't compliant with the project's rules, so it'll highlight it with a blue underline to give you a heads up. If I hover over the highlighted string, it'll tell me the issue. In this case, that it's not using single quotes. And you have the option to automatically fix it right here without leaving the code editor. Also, the extension can fix Rubocop offenses that are auto-correctable whenever you save the file, making it dead simple to keep your code up to standards. So if I press Ctrl S to save the file, we'll see it automatically changes the string to use single quotes. This example shown here is very simple, but having the extension enabled in your code editor is extremely helpful as you go through your day-to-day development tasks. If you don't use VS Code as your code editor, other popular editors like Sublime Text, Emacs, and Vim have similar extensions or plugins. I highly recommend installing an extension or plugin that contains similar functionality for your editor because it'll definitely help you with your Ruby projects. This extension will prevent almost all static code analysis issues from sneaking into your commits, but it's not a silver bullet. It won't automatically fix all offenses for you. And if you're working on a larger team, not everyone will have these extensions set up properly on their code editor. So you need another layer to protect this type of code from slipping through into your repository. A tactic I like to use for this are source code version control hooks. Most version control systems like Git have mechanisms to trigger actions whenever certain activities occur, like making a commit or pushing code into a remote repository. We can use these hooks to run scripts that prevent a code commit or push to a remote repository if a condition fails. Since static code analysis only takes a second or two, hooks are an excellent way to catch any issues early. Let's create a hook on this project so anytime a developer attempts to make a commit, it will run Rubocop, and if the static code analysis fails, it'll block the commit from happening. This project uses Git as its version control system. Git stores all of its hooks under the .git/hooks directory at the root of your project. So let's open that now. Anytime you initialize a Git repository, it'll include some sample hook scripts. All of these are regular shell scripts, but you can also use Ruby, Python, or other executable scripts. As long as the script can return a non-zero exit code to indicate a failure, you can use something other than shell scripting if you're more comfortable with another programming language. Git has many different hooks to trigger at different times during the development lifecycle. You can check out their documentation for more details. For our example, I'm looking to run a hook before a commit occurs, which is the pre-commit hook. This hook gets executed as soon as a git commit command happens, and it's typically used as a safety net to catch something you may have forgotten. To create a pre-commit hook, we'll create a new file here called pre-commit in this directory. If you notice, there's a pre-commit sample script here, but because this is a simple example, I'll just start it from scratch. Since this is a shell script, first we'll start with the shebang line to indicate that this is a shell script. Next, we'll print out a message to indicate that the pre-commit hook fired off the Rubocop static code analysis check using echo. Finally, we'll execute Rubocop using the bundle exec Rubocop command. By default, Rubocop will return a non-zero exit code if there are any offenses, so we don't need to run this with any additional flags or configuration. However, it would be nice to include a message to let the developer know that they need to fix Rubocop issues before committing their changes, just in case it finds an offense. So we can check that our error code was not zero using an if statement. For the condition, we'll check that the last executed command, in this case bundle exec Rubocop, returned a non-zero exit code. We can check the exit code by using the special $? Variable, which is a special variable in shell scripts used to indicate the exit code of the last executed command. Next, we'll use the NE operator, which stands for not equal, to make sure that the exit code is not equal to 0. So if this condition is true, we want to print out an error message using echo again. We also need to make sure that this script returns a non-zero exit code so the pre-commit hook doesn't proceed with the commit. Otherwise, this script will exit with a 0 exit code and Git will still perform the commit, which we don't want. Let's save the file, but there's one more thing left to do. Git hooks need to be executable shell scripts, so let's make sure that this one is. I'll open the terminal here in VS Code and run the chmod command with the executable option, which is the +X, on this script. So once we do this, the pre-commit hook is now active for our repository. So let's see it in action. Coming back to our code base, let's say that I'm working on this file and I don't have any extensions to help me catch Rubocop offenses. I've disabled the Ruby LSP extension just to make sure for this example. So let's say I accidentally create the same string as before, which contains double quotes instead of the enforced single quotes. Now, Rubocop will find an offense in this one, but let's imagine that I completely ignore running Rubocop locally and I don't have any extensions to tell me anything about it. In the terminal, I'll add this file to stage it for a commit. Then I'll go ahead and commit this with a message. Now, instead of having this code committed directly and potentially pushed into the remote repository, Git is going to run the pre-commit hook that we created first to check that everything is okay. As you can see, Rubocop will run, find the issues in our code, and print out the error message we set. It won't proceed with the code commit, and our files will remain staged. This pre-commit hook prevented me from committing this inconsistency into the repo, which I can then fix quickly since I was just working on it. Once I fix the issue, I can attempt my commit again. Rubocop will run, and because it found no offenses, my code is actually committed. Having a pre-commit hook like this for your static code analysis setup will save you a ton of time and rework, since it will catch these problems early instead of weeks or months later. While version control hooks are a great way to catch issues from sneaking into the codebase, developers can also bypass them easy if they choose. For instance, I can use the no verify flag when committing on Git, and it will run my pre-commit hook. That means I can commit and push code with Rubocop offenses without being blocked by the pre-commit hook. Although this is not encouraged for obvious reasons, I've seen developers skip these hooks for both legit and not so legit reasons. If you want to encourage your team to follow the coding standards set upon your project, my final tip is to set up Rubocop to run as part of your continuous integration pipeline. Similar to setting up a hook in your version control system, running static code analysis along with other tests and continuous integration will serve as a final security barrier before your code gets merged into the primary branch and gets deployed into production. The Airport Gap project is hosted on GitHub, and I'm using GitHub Actions as my continuous integration service to run my tests after pushing my code into the repository. I'll use GitHub Actions to demonstrate how to run Rubocop for a Ruby on Rails application, but you can use similar steps for any continuous integration systems you might use like CircleCI or Jenkins. GitHub Actions looks inside the .github/workflows directory in the root of your project to find workflows to execute. I already have a few workflows for this project, like running unit and API tests and building Docker images. For our static code analysis process, I'll create a separate workflow, so I'll create a new file in this directory and call it rubocop.yaml. The first step in creating a GitHub Actions workflow is to give it a name. For this workflow, I'll call it Rubocop. Next, we need to determine when we want GitHub Actions to run this workflow. I want to run it when pushing code onto the main branch, which is my primary branch, and also when a new pull request is open so I can ensure Rubocop checks them automatically. We'll set this up by using the on setting and then adding push underneath it, specifying that we only want to run this on the main branch. I'll also add pull request here and leave the rest empty so GitHub Actions runs it against any branch and on any type of activity when opening a new pull request or updating an existing one. Finally, we get to configuring how the workflow will run under the jobs key. This step is highly dependent on your project setup, so I won't explain everything in detail on this video. However, these are some of the common steps needed to set up a Ruby on Rails application on GitHub Actions. The first configuration setting under jobs is to give it an identifier, which shows up as part of the workflow execution details. So for this one, I'll call it static code analysis. Next, we need to tell GitHub Actions where we want to run this workflow. You can run these workflows on your own systems, but GitHub Actions hosts a few runners that work really great. We'll use the Ubuntu latest runner, which as of this recording is the latest LTS version of Ubuntu Server. The next configuration we'll do here is to set up a few environment variables that we need for this project. We can do that under the env key. Your project may require many other settings here, along with other variables that must remain secret. So look up the GitHub Actions documentation if you need more information on setting this up. Our project also requires a few additional services, such as a Postgres database and Redis. We'll set this up under the Services key. These services will use Docker containers to spin up what the application needs to operate. I won't explain each setting here, but when using service containers, you'll have to set them up according to your needs, like which ports are accessible and which environment variables to set up inside the container. You can read more about how GitHub Actions uses service containers in their documentation. With these settings, we now have our GitHub hosted runner configured for our application. Now we can begin defining which steps to take to run Rubocop under the Steps key. First, we'll have to set up the Rails application on the runner, which means installing gems and other dependencies before running Rubocop. I'll go through each step quickly since they're pretty common for Rails applications running under GitHub Actions runners. First, we need to check out our code into the runner by using GitHub's checkout action. This action will check out the code in your repo so your workflow can access it. The next step is to set up Ruby and install all gem dependencies. For this, we'll use another action called setup Ruby. This action allows us to specify which version of Ruby we use in our project, along with running bundler install and cache the installed gems for future workflow executions. The airport gap application also needs to set up Node.js to work. We can use another action called setup node, which works similar to the setup Ruby action we just set up. This action lets us specify the Node.js version to use in the workflow, along with specifying which package manager to use for caching purposes. In the airport gap application, we're using Yarn, so we'll specify Yarn in the cache. However, unlike the setup Ruby action, which automatically installs all gem dependencies, we'll need to set up an additional step to install our JavaScript dependencies. We'll set that up by running the yarn install command in our runner. We'll run the yarn install command with the frozen lock file flag to ensure that we're using the exact package version specified in the yarn lock file to avoid any surprises. With this, we have our GitHub Actions runner set up to execute any command for our Rails application. The last thing remaining is to run Rubocop, so we'll just create one final step to run the Rubocop command. When running a workflow on GitHub Actions, the workflow run is considered a success only when all steps execute with no issues, meaning they all return a zero exit code. As mentioned earlier, when setting up the pre-commit hook, Rubocop returns a non-zero exit code if it finds any offenses. So if a developer makes a commit that doesn't follow the project's coding standards, the workflow will fail and let the team know of the issue. So let's save this file, and then let's make a commit to our main branch. As you can see, our pre-commit hook is still running and working. No issues found. So we can now push this into GitHub, and once we push this code into GitHub, if everything is set up correctly, GitHub will detect it and execute the workflow since we specified we want to run it on every push. So as we see here, we can see that our Rubocop workflow is already running. After a few minutes of the initial setup, we'll have the results of the workflow and everything looks like it passed. Having tools like Rubocop in your projects is nice, but it won't matter if you or your team aren't using them early and often. Make it as easy as possible to use these processes to ensure you're keeping your codebase in order. The 3 tips shown in this video will help you get the most out of your static code analysis setup for your Rails projects. From setting up your code editor to catching bad commits, These tips may only take a few minutes to set up, but the benefits they bring to your codebase will last for years, making your development more efficient and effective. If you found this video helpful, please consider subscribing to this channel for more tips on helping Rails developers ship their code confidently from development to deployment. You can also check out my website for more in-depth articles covering Rails, testing, DevOps, and other software engineering topics. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.